Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Grace Coming to Chats, brought to you by Grace Coming to Church here in Philadelphia. Here in Philadelphia. I am your host, Caleb Watt, here with not my usual co-host, Kim Hu. Kim, how are you doing today?
Doing all right. It's a little chilly for Philadelphia, but it's fine.
It is, and I totally forgot to adjust the height of your mic. Give me 1 second.
Okay. I'm like, I can't see you. I mean, I can. I can see through the screen thing. There we go.
Nice.
All right. Oh, wow. Yeah,
That's
you're
normal.
not.
Yeah, I know.
You can see me now.
No, I can see you. I'm like, there's something odd about this setup. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I can't see Kim because her mic is too high.
It's not that I'm not P-Dog.
Yeah,
I just
also,
look
yeah,
different.
You're not my usual co-host.
I am not.
Yeah, I said not my usual since the way I introduced P-Dog last time. Last time was my usual co-host.
Oh, yes. Not the usual co-host.
Not the usual co-host. But Kim, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so a couple weeks ago, Pastor Doug wrapped up his series on stewardship. And so I had this random thought while he was giving, I think, probably his last sermon. Because a lot of the conversation has been about generosity, right? And I think money can be kind of a hard topic, but I think he gave us a lot of really practical ideas and steps. But I had this idea of, how much we tithe is based on how much money we have, right? And that will flux and that will change based on who you are, your circumstances, and that's all well and fine. But I thought about what would it look like to tithe back our time, right? Everyone in theory has the same 24 hours every single day to spend, right? Like time is, people use that metaphor where time is something that you can spend and never save, right? And so I know like time, it doesn't exactly work out math wise. Everyone has the same 24 hours, right?
2.4
like,
hours a day.
Yeah, no. Adjusted for inflation.
Yeah.
But like in theory, everyone gets 24 hours a day. What you choose to do with it is up to you. And I think that's also not to discount that it's not quite the same 24 hours, right? I think some of us, based on privilege or based on life setting or responsibility, the time that we have to spend on the things that are really important will change for each person. And so it's not exactly the same. But I think if we were honest with ourselves, we do have some extra time left over when we look at the balance at the end of the day, the end of the week. And so what are we doing with that time, or what would it look like to take that time and invest it and tithe it back like the way that we would tithe back our money?
Yeah, 'cause as you were saying that to me, it almost sounds like I'm asking the question, like, does it necessarily even have to be the leftover time that I have, right? Should I not be intentional with all the time, right? And then maybe like allocate it to different places, right? Because like I guess maybe it's because P Doug and I just finished talking about like faithfulness in the workplace and stuff like that. So my mind is geared on faithfulness, right? It's like, yeah, thinking about like tithing money, right? Like there's a sense in which, okay, yeah, I give this specific proportion of my income to the church to support the church or whatever. But it's not like I can just do whatever I want with the rest of my money, right? I should still be faithful in how I use that, right? So how do you see like, yeah, like when you're talking about tithing time, is this like specifically serving ministry, or like is it like something that's like more holistic, right, than something like that?
Yeah, I think just with money, I don't know if P Doug went in this hard during his stewardship thing, but like when we think about it, like all of our money is not ours. Like the means to generate or what has been given to us, like any good thing we have is from the Lord, right? In theory, all of it belongs to God, right? That's why we are good stewards of, because he knows we have needs. And that's why we can choose to spend our money on our rent and to, buy groceries and pay our bills and things like that. But if we translate that to our time, you're right. Isn't all of our life the Lord's?
Right.
Shouldn't all of our time be for God, right? And I think as a whole it is. And that's why we have to be responsible for things like going to work and getting our schoolwork done and caring for the people in our lives. But you're right, when we have the time that remains after we've kind of taken care of those, what does that time look like? Or even in pushing back in some other ways too. I think to me, when I think about tithing time, there are things that I think don't count.
Okay. Oh, okay.
I think this is I don't know if this is someone else's concept. This is probably not an original thought. Like who has an original thought ever? There's nothing original under the sun anymore.
Nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun. It's just we're all just saying the same thing. So this is probably not an original thought, but to me, when I think about what does it look like to give back my time for the Lord, things that don't count are like going to church on Sunday for
Mm,
Sunday worship.
mm-hmm,
To me, that doesn't count because uh, that is just something like we receive much from that.
mm,
It is not for like God doesn't need us to give him glory. He's already deserving of that.
mm,
And I think P. Doug talks about that in I think one of his last stewardship messages about worship. It's like if we will not worship, the rocks will cry out.
mm,
God will receive his glory. It's whether or not we take the opportunity to participate in that.
mm-hmm,
So Sunday worship is not like giving back to God.
mm,
I think like things like going to family group or like your Bible study is not tithing back your time. Like
mm,
you gain so much from sitting as a collective under the authority of the Word of God and to learn and to read and like pray and be with each other. Like you
mm-hmm,
receive so much. So
mm,
then, like, where are you specifically going into spaces and investing your time so that other people will be blessed? To me,
mm.
that's what counts as like me giving back or like tithing back my time.
So it's like service oriented in a
Yes.
sense, right? Like instead of being fed, you're participating in feeding.
Yeah, or I think that's the really nice way of saying it. I think you're right. That is the goal. That is the benefit that
Mm-hmm,
someone else receives. Someone else is fed. Someone else is blessed
mm-hmm,
because I sacrificed, because
mm,
I gave.
mm-hmm,
I think that's the equation that someone else would receive because I chose to give of myself in this way.
mm. So maybe I'm splitting hairs then at this point, but saying like Sunday service doesn't count because I'm being fed, but if I serve at Sunday service, then that's like maybe a little bit different, right? Or like serving for like family group or like Bible study and stuff like that, you would see that as a little bit different.
I think it's a
Yeah.
little bit different.
Uh huh.
And I think like it's not like a zero sum thing where
Sure.
it's just
Sure.
like it's
Sure. Yeah.
all giving, it's all receiving, right? There is like this like ebb and flow of it because I
Right.
think as you serve,
Uh
you
huh.
also do receive in a really special and unique
Mm,
way. You know and you understand things at a deeper level than the casual like Sunday service attendee. And I
mm-hmm,
think that is a great joy and a great blessing to understand more deeply, not just like who God is, but to understand your community
mm-hmm,
more. That's a great gift.
mm,
Not everyone gets to understand that and to hold that information and then do something with it,
mm.
right? It's like the ways that, for example, something, shout out to worship team, right? Something that people don't
Big shout
realize. Big out
outs.
to shout out to
Yes.
worship team, or someone joked this. Oh, it's called like wire ministry.
Oh
Where
yeah. Yeah.
like, so can you tell me what is wire
Wire
ministry?
ministry is setting the cable so that it look okay. It look nice.
So they
Yeah.
look nice,
And
right?
so that nobody trips.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. So you have to run, like worship team has just like thousands of feet of cable, right? That they're
Mm-hmm.
running every Sunday just so people can have a worship experience that is really inviting and warm and oriented towards the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
But part of that also is entering into the physical space and like
Mm-hmm.
not tripping over this fat extension cord that we need to run so that we can have power from like the back of Meyerson to the front of Meyerson, right? And who knows like how literally you have to get down on like your physical hands and knees to
Mm-hmm.
do wire ministry.
Mm-hmm.
You it takes a sacrifice of time,
Mm-hmm.
right? You could use those 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes to be practicing or like to go grab coffee at Starbucks in that
Mm-hmm.
time. But no, this is part of the service.
Mm-hmm.
This is the time that it takes.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, people are not breaking their ankles coming into Sunday service.
Mm-hmm.
But in that posture, I'm sure that's probably one of the least glamorous parts
Mm.
of worship team,
Right.
right? But
Yeah.
there's also a knowledge of like, oh, as I'm doing it, I'm thinking about other people. I'm thinking that this is good so that my brothers and sisters literally come into a worshipful space and not worry
Mm.
about, tripping down the aisle.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a giving and there's a receiving in it, but the orientation of intention, the orientation of my heart is towards the other and not for myself. Right?
Mm.
No one goes onto worship team thinking like I'm going to be so well fed. Like I'm going to no one does that, right? But like you would not argue that if you serve with good intention for the other, you cannot I would hope that no one would say like but I received nothing in return.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. That's a relevant example for me.
Yeah, wire ministry.
Yeah, wire ministry. One of my old bosses would say, "Hey, Caleb, why is there so much spaghetti on this stage?" And I'd be like, You're right, Chris. You're right.
Just an Olive Garden up here.
Yeah, Olive Garden. Yeah. Yeah. Huh, so, but like talking about like being fed, right? Like, how do you feel like this balances out or like plays out in different seasons of life,
Mm,
right? Because there are some seasons of where I feel like people are called to rest,
mm-hmm,
right? And then some seasons where it's like, yeah, you're called to serve a little bit more,
mm-hmm,
right? And maybe there's even like the question of like, my mind is going too many places, but even the question of like, how do I continue serving and dedicating my time in an intentional manner
mm-hmm.
and not just doing it, right?
Right,
For the sake of doing it, right?
right.
Because I mean, there's also like, again, I keep comparing this to like the monetary tithe, right? Because that's a tangible example and one of the things that we talked a lot about. But like, yeah, even with that, right? There's a oh, I'm just giving 10%, yada yada. Now it's usual, is normalized, right? I don't really think about it anymore. It doesn't feel like that much of a sacrifice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. So how do these things continue to challenge us? Maybe the right question, right? How do
Yeah,
we
yeah.
continue serving with the right heart?
That's a good question. I think it has with time or with money.
Mm-hmm.
The question that we're asking ourselves about what can I give is it starts because we're doing constant math and an equation of what do I need.
Hmm.
And I think it starts of what do I need? What do I need my money for? What do I need my time for? I think it
Mm-hmm.
stems from a very similar place.
Mm-hmm.
I think what gets us tripped up in the process is that we dictate to ourselves what we need
Hmm.
rather than asking God, what are my needs?
Oh,
And like,
baby.
it's because I think it's
Yeah.
easy for us. And I think as you get older, that's
Mm-hmm.
part of like spiritual growth and maturity that you should know what you need. Like, hey, I know I'm a person who needs 7 hours of sleep, and that's good and great. Like, sleep is a gift from the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
especially like good sleep, and that's great.
Mm-hmm.
And you should know that, and you should know that that is not necessarily a boundary you should cross because
Mm-hmm.
you have seen the deficits of when you don't get 7 hours of sleep. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. But I think for other things, especially what do I need to rest, I think a lot of the times we just allow ourselves to dictate what we want out of our rest. And
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes when we're deciding that, we're normally not doing it from a place that we are looking at it holistically, and we're not necessarily in the healthiest mindset
Mm-hmm.
or the healthiest frame of like heart to decide what we need. And so when we are in crisis, when we're in a deficit, when we are burnt out, and when we are tired, and that's when we realize we need rest, we are normally not making choices that are based on what we need. We are just reacting to this great pain and discomfort that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is a signal that we have let our rest go beyond a level that is like get depleted to a level that is not healthy.
Hmm.
And so I think when you're making choices about your time and your needs, you need to do it when nothing is on fire, right? Because if you look at your bank account and you've got $5 in there and you're like, be generous, of course you're not going to make a good plan, right?
Mhm.
Because you see that there is a great need because something happened.
Right.
Was there a way that your bank account didn't have to dip so low? Did something happen? Were you unaware or maybe a little not irresponsible? Yeah, probably. We'll just
Probably
name it. Probably,
irresponsible, yeah.
right? That was there a way that maybe like you just spent a little, you kind of ignored your budget that you put in place, and now there are consequences to it. And so rather than, I think we swing too far the other way. Like I need to overly compensate that. I need to hoard then, right? Or I spent too much of my time doing things that I thought were important or I thought that mattered. And now I'm so exhausted that now I will just completely abandon all of the things that are good. I will abandon my responsibilities. I will abandon my relationships and just hoard back all of my time because I'm so in deficit. And so I think like when you are swinging to the extremes, you're not making good plans. And so I think when it comes to what do I need and how do I give, it comes from, I think what you brought up, rest, it comes from like a regular rhythm of that. Resting is something that should not be, resting is not an emergency. Resting is a rhythm. And so if we're not resting and we are not in a healthy place, we cannot actually give a good gauge of what do I need. Because everything's on fire. I'm always exhausted, right? I'm like, ooh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, Rhythms of rest is a common theme on this pod chat.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think if we don't, I think it's similar with our money. When you can't take good stock of what you have, you don't know how to give. When you
Mhm,
don't take good stock of your energy and your time and your responsibilities and what you need to take care of, you don't
mhm,
know what's left over.
mhm,
And so I think when it comes to how do I discern, back to the original question, how
mhm,
do I know when to give? It's like, hey, let me go back to the Lord and ask, what do I need to do in the
mm,
time? What does it mean to be faithful?
mhm.
One of our
Faithful.
favorite word.
Yes.
What does it mean to be faithful to the things of my life,
Mm,
knowing that God has probably given me enough
mm,
to be faithful to those things. So then, if God is faithful to my needs, how can then I press into be faithful in the other components of loving other people and serving and giving out of my time and energy?
mm. I see. It reminds me a lot of, was it Matthew 6? Like, don't worry, the not worry passage, but also a lot of Proverbs 30. I think it's like 9. It's one of the verses that I've been, well, I think I've even brought it up on a pod chat before, right? But it's a verse that I've been thinking a lot about. It's like, give me neither poverty nor riches, right? But feed me what is needful for me,
Mm-hmm.
right? And yeah, there's like such a, I don't know. I think what you're saying reminds me a lot of that passage and maybe even that prayer, right? Because it's like, yeah, sometimes I don't know what's needful for me. I don't know what I need. Or if I, even when I do know what I need, I'm ignoring the fact that I know what I need and thinking that I need something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, entrusting that to the Lord and saying, like, hey, give me what is needful for me. And then, what is it, 2 Corinthians 8, right? Giving out of your own generosity. Of course, that's with respect to money, but like, I think it's so aptly applied to time as well. It makes a lot of sense, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think as you share that, it's one of my favorite passages thinking about the church is in Acts 2
Mm-hmm.
at the end in verses like around like 40 to
Mm-hmm.
44. We highlight a lot of how they gave out of themselves, that like people
Mm-hmm.
ate bread or like, broke bread together. They gave of
Mm-hmm.
the possessions that no one was in need. But I think when you also look at that passage, they spent time in devoting themselves to the word and
Mm-hmm.
fellowship and prayer together. And that takes time.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that like fellowship, and I think that would go into like not like the tithing thing, but like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that requires to give of ourselves,
Right.
right? There is not a time where you just give money and like not time. I think that paints a rather incomplete picture
Mm-hmm.
of relationships,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because ultimately, time is building relationships, time is building up other people.
Mm-hmm.
And while maybe we do not have a lot of money to at our disposal to do that, I think the ways that we can give of our time to other people, I think
Mm-hmm.
actually goes really far in
Mm-hmm.
developing those relationships. What is the cost of like your friend who failed their MCATs and to like just sit with them, right? Like you don't necessarily need to show up with a pint of ice cream, but what does it mean just to sit with them in
Mm-hmm.
their sadness and in their tears?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to maybe run an errand for a friend, right? Like they just have a super busy week and they just like, hey, I'm really out of toilet paper. Like if I'll give you I'll give you money for it, but can you just go pick it up for me?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like what is
Mm-hmm.
the cost of running an errand for a friend?
Mm-hmm.
I think in a lot of ways when we start thinking about it like that, uh we would be surprised how many of those things we can actually lean into and take on.
Right. It's, again, to me, it just screams like, be generous to the amount of grace, proportionately to the amount of grace, right, that you've been shown, right? As Paul kind of says in 2 Corinthians 8, because like a lot of the things that you just said, right? Like to me, it comes straight out like Romans 12, right? Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, like show hospitality, be at peace with others, right? That sort of thing. And Romans 12 comes after Romans 8, Romans 3, Romans 5, Romans, like all the other things. It's like, wow, look at this like 9, 11 chapters of like God showing grace to you. Now offer yourselves as a living sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
And then he goes into talking about indicative, therefore imperative. That's one of my disciples used to say a lot.
But when you say it like that, I'm like, oh, right. Like there's a lot of Romans before we get to like be a living sacrifice.
Yeah,
And I think
yeah.
it shows like, oh, we are very wealthy in a
Yeah.
lot of ways that I don't think we necessarily consider.
Mm,
Because if we're not coming from and we think about it a lot in like some sort of like a orphan or like poverty mindset,
mm,
it's hard to overcome that because there's a real fear, there's a real like need that we like, or a discomfort that is inside of us,
Mhm.
but are we willing to challenge our
Mhm.
perception of how much we have?
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I think it's a very internal thing, right? Because time is time,
Mhm.
right? Like, and we go through seasons. Like, people have, deliverables at work. You have finals in school. You have like a family crisis and emergency. Like, those are all seasons that need our time, need our attention. And
Mm.
I think a lot of us know, oh, those are things important. That takes precedent. It's a
Mhm.
priority. I invest in those things, right? That
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah.
It's about the rest of the days. It's the rest of the, 48 weeks that we have
Yeah.
in the year.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if do you get a lot of questions on the pod chat?
Do I get a lot of questions? No, I don't.
Okay, so I want to ask
Oh
you.
no!
I want to ask you a
Shoot,
question.
I shouldn't have said that.
It's too late. Your answer doesn't change the fact that I'm about to ask you a question.
I only ask myself questions.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
And that really special,
Yeah,
really
in
special
that
episode.
one episode. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, so I have a question for you.
Oh
Right?
shoot.
If we're talking about the richness of our lives or what we
Mhm.
have been given, right?
Mhm.
As Christians, I feel like it is a truth that we are rich
Mm.
in a lot of grace, right?
Mhm.
And a lot we've like the new life we have been given in Christ.
Mhm.
But why does that not? Why do you think that doesn't translate into our time? Speaking to us as this millennial Gen Z
Oof.
population.
I'm the Gen Z rep right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your
Wow.
services.
Shoot, I have to think about this. Yeah, why doesn't that translate? I think. Ooh, the first word that comes to mind is bifurcation.
Say more.
um, like the idea of like something being split, right?
Mm.
It's almost like I've been forgiven for my sins, or like I've found like maybe this joy, right, in this one area of my life, but that's just that area of my life, right? And it sounds very cliche to say, right? Like cordoning off my spirituality, my faith life into like one box, and then like the rest of my life in the other. But it's like I think that's to me like where it first starts, right?
Mm.
Like when I think about like reasons when I haven't been generous, or maybe like why I'm not more generous now, it's like, yeah, I either separate faith out into like one section of my life and not let it permeate the rest of it, right? Not see how grace is like, in effect in the rest of my life,
Mm.
or I say to myself, or I think I've say to myself, here's the sentiment, right? It's like, oh, I already do the Sunday thing, right? I already check off enough of the boxes, which again is a very cliche answer, but it's very true,
Yeah.
right? Like I think that I'm doing enough, but I'm not actually mindful of what I'm doing, right? I'm not intentional with what I'm doing. And maybe me saying this, maybe then the time doesn't necessarily have to increase in that case, right? But it's like the intentionality is different, right? When you're thinking about why am I serving? How am I serving, right? What am I doing when I'm serving, right? Am I just going through the motions, or am I um, really being intentional? Even like praying about my service, right? That's like another aspect of like, oh, I gotta sacrifice like a few minutes before I sleep or whatever, or when I wake up to pray about like my church, like when I'm serving, where my tithe is going, time and money, right? But like a lot of times I don't, right? Because it feels disconnected, or I feel like I'm already doing enough,
Mm.
right? So yeah, that's where my mind goes when you ask that question, like why doesn't that, you know, like the whole living sacrifice thing, why doesn't that apply to my whole life? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's a question that I have for you too, right? Since you're full time ministry,
Sure.
right? Like, what does thinking about serving look like for you, or tithing your time when like literally all your time is like ministry, or like I guess ministry and school, which you're coming up on the end of.
Hallelujah.
Congrats.
Praise God.
Praise God. But it's like, I don't want to. Maybe this feeds into like the I'm splitting my life into parts mindset, right? But like, there's almost a sense in which if I work a normal job, right, I get to take a break from like church and like serving and like stuff like that. Whereas if you're always in it, right, it feels a little bit different. So what does tithing time for you look like, right? Or when you think about it?
Yeah, I think for me, I have to expand a little bit more into who in my life is God calling me to invest into?
Mm,
How can I show up in other spaces or be there for people? And
mm,
so, um, this is, I wouldn't even count this as like tithing my time necessarily. This
mhm,
is just, I think, what it, what does it look like when you say that all of your time belongs to the Lord?
mm,
And that if he presents you with an opportunity, would you say yes to those opportunities?
mm,
And so I think just like to give like a small, like small things here or there just to like, oh, how could I lean in to bless other people?
Mhm.
Um, Tim and I live in Center City, and we've been trying to be more intentional getting to know our physical neighbors.
Mm.
And so that involves like they have our phone numbers and they'll hit us up for different things. But like things like my neighbors to the right of me are quite old.
Mm.
They're like they could be my grandparents, I think. But when
Mhm.
we had like the great Philadelphia water crisis of 2023,
Mhm.
they called me saying like, hey, like if you're going to the store, could you get us some water, not just for drinking, but for some of their medical devices?
Mm.
And so that was something that like Tim and I coordinated because it's not that they can't get it. It's water is really heavy.
Mm.
And so like, yeah, sure. Or my neighbors 2 doors down, they travel a lot. So they're like, hey, do you mind like watering our plants? Or do you mind like if this package is coming in and it's really sensitive that it needs to go inside or like not be in the sun? Like, do you mind keeping an eye out for it? I'm
Mm.
like, yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
And that doesn't take a lot of my time,
Mhm.
but I do have to be mindful of it. It takes mental space and
Mhm.
capacity to not forget their packages or not forget to buy them some water.
Mhm.
But it to me, I'm like, oh, it's not even just like tithing, like it's like a commitment. It's just
Mhm.
an availability in a
Mm.
sense. Like, so for me, I have to more so look for opportunities and check my availability to like press
Mm.
in or to develop relationships that are outside of the maybe bounds of quote unquote ministry.
Mm.
So it forces me to be a little bit more creative
Yeah.
because I think it's harder the other way. You're like, oh, but I do enough. Like I've already met up with like 15 people.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
why do
yeah.
I need to whatever? But like, oh, you're right.
Mm.
It's still in my heart. I still have to check like what does it mean to show up, and like
Mhm.
my intention is still here. My intention is still to bless other people.
Right.
You know, you can serve and you can do ministry and it all looks fine on the outside, but inside you're like bitter and mad that
Mm.
people tripped over your wires and you don't appreciate, you know, you untangle the spaghetti of everything.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I think it's a posture or looking, I think for me, it's looking for the availability, looking for the opportunities and saying
Mhm.
yes to those things.
Mhm.
Cause you don't always get to see those opportunities.
Mhm.
I don't believe that we create them on our own. I think God really allows and orchestrates our
Mm.
lives. I think we can position ourselves well,
Right.
like to say, like, here I am, Lord, you know, like a Samuel moment, like you're serving,
Yeah.
you know, you're here I am, like your servant is speaking. And
Mhm.
like God didn't speak to Samuel for a night. He spoke to him and gave him a word for his life.
Mhm.
And I'm like, wow, that's not tithing your life. That is saying yes, that like all of my life belongs to the Lord. And I
Mhm.
think that's what I kind of hope for all
Right.
of this. I think the concept of like giving back, I think that's like a small bite-sized way of
Mhm.
us to see that, oh, how can I be generous with my time? But I think all of Christian living
Mm.
looks like all of my life is for the Lord.
Yeah, living sacrifice, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. To me, it sounds like, right, it's like it almost touches, like, on the idea of, like, spiritual disciplines,
Sure.
right? Like, it's almost like and I think maybe this is one of the ways that I've thought about disciplines in the past. It's like, I do this thing, or maybe you've heard, like, the duty to delight sorta
Mm-hmm.
paradigm before. Like, I don't know why I need to read the Bible when I first started reading the Bible. I didn't know why I needed to pray when I first started praying. I just knew, "Hey, now I'm a Christian or I'm committing my life to this. I'm gonna start doing it because it's either the right thing to do or like maybe the right thing to develop that into like a consistent habit." But it's only until later, right, when I find a delight, when I find the and
Mm.
recognize the the greater truth or the greater reality behind it. And I think that's what this conversation sounds like a lot of, right? Like
Mm.
even like tithing time, tithing money. It's like, yeah, we can say, oh, I understand how my life is given to me from God, right? Like I can say I know that God's the one who gives me all the good things, like James 1, right? Like I can say God gives me all my money, right? But like I don't really know that until I start implementing like maybe the discipline of like tithing my time, tithing
Mm.
my money, and then over time, right, that becomes more and more of a reality too where yeah, I can understand what it means to be a living sacrifice, right? I don't
Yeah.
know. That's what it sounds like to me a lot
I think
right now.
I think you're right because it is hard, right? The
Yeah.
duty of it is challenging. And I think that's
Mhm.
something that we don't have to like we don't have to lie about that. It's
Mhm.
difficult.
Mhm.
It's not everyone's like I'm gonna do all these things and like give up all my time and money and like I feel great. Like I'm like I hope we hope for that, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's like, oh, there is no way to develop into that delight, into that joy until
Mhm.
you actually do it.
Mm.
Like you cannot just wait and sit and be like, and when I'm in a good mood and when I'm
Right.
happy and when I feel satisfied, then I will do it,
Fair
right?
weather Christian. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't. It doesn't work like that. Cause then we like when it is not fair weather,
Mhm.
will you just drop off? And that
Mm.
that happens a lot of the time. You're like,
Right.
nope, can't do that anymore. And that's not to say like we serve to the point where we neglect ourselves, right? Like I'm
Right.
not saying that at all. But it is a commitment,
Mhm.
right? Tithing is not something where you think about every week. You just commit to that. That's
Right.
just in your line, like your line, a line item in your budget. I
Mhm.
think at times and then, seasons change, seasons come, you get a raise, you get laid off, you incur more debt, whatever it is, you restock, you
Mhm.
look at it again and you start over,
Mhm.
right? But with the same heart and with the same intention. I
Mm.
think the same thing with our time, right? You take
Right.
stock. What can I give? And that
Mhm.
just becomes a commitment. I
Mm.
will just choose to do that. That is not something I'm going to debate anymore. And to
Mhm.
say like, yes, there's nuance and there's room for flexibility. But
Right.
for the most part, my intention and my heart is to set to give my time in this way. And so I'm going to make a
Mm.
commitment to the point where I don't have to debate it every time it comes up.
Right. It's like making Second Corinthians, making the commitment to give a set proportion, or like what you're going, making up your mind, right, to give that, and doing so cheerfully, as Paul writes. And yeah, I think the beauty, again, as you're saying this, right, like making commitment, and then also tying back to what you said earlier about how you get to see, like, a different side of, like, faith, or like even have a different experience with like the grace of God, right? Or like understand it more profoundly when you're serving. It's like, well, Paul again says, according to the proportion of grace that's been shown to you, right? And like all that whole thing. It's like your understanding of grace just increases. And as it increases, then perhaps you find that you're able to give a little bit more, right? And you're able to stretch and grow in that way. Huh. I
It's a
like
very
that.
it's a very positive spiral.
Yeah.
It's like an upward
Yeah.
trajectory spiral rather than a downward one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right? Because it's like I don't have enough, therefore I will not give. Therefore I will not
Right.
understand joy. Therefore I will,
Mm.
and then I don't have joy, and therefore I have no motivation,
Mhm.
and I still have the same amount, and the spiral or the process stays downward in a way.
Mhm.
Versus, oh, I can give a little bit,
Mhm.
experience that joy,
Mhm.
be motivated beyond the duty,
Right.
give a little bit more,
Mm.
experience a little bit more joy,
Mm.
right? And I'm like, oh wow, that is a beautiful thing to witness.
Right.
And that's only because I have given my initial yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So then what would you say, I guess, yeah, how do you pull out of the spiral going downwards if you're there?
Ooh.
Right? Because earlier we also touched on like, oh, you can't make the right decision, or it's hard to make the right decisions when everything's on fire. But like, let's say you are there, right? Because a
Hmm.
lot of people are, right?
Yeah.
What do I do then? Right? How
Yeah.
how do I evaluate what's going on when everything feels like it's out of control, right? And then choose to give generously from there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think if you're there, I think of course the first thing is to like put out the fires.
Hmm.
So as far I think as you're able to is like, hey, what do I need to do so that in like my mental and my physical and my emotional self, am I healthy? Am I
Hmm.
taking care of myself? Right. I
Mhm.
don't think God calls us to neglect ourselves to like, the point that we're like unwell or we're sick.
Mhm.
So I think it takes time. That means where in the extraneous things can I
Hmm.
put those on pause
Hmm.
in order to prioritize being well?
Hmm.
And so I think a lot of the times it looks a lot like entertainment sometimes,
Mhm.
where it's like, oh, I need to decompress. So I need to watch TV for 3 hours and then I'll be well. I'm
Hmm.
like, no, you probably just need to go to sleep. You probably just need to go to sleep more regularly,
Mhm.
and to not binge and like stay up or like use your time in a weird way.
Mhm.
So I think there's like one, like get to a baseline where you are well.
Hmm.
And that I think then look at what you are committed to and your time and priorities. I think that there's a lot of it you have to revisit your original yes.
Hmm.
Why 3 weeks, 3 months ago did you make that time commitment? And is your heart has Lord like still kept you to that commitment?
Hmm.
Is your heart still for it? And even if your heart is still not for it, that's fine. But I think the
Mhm.
question that gets skipped is, God, do you want me to keep doing that with my time?
Hmm.
And if God says, I want you to do it, but your heart is not there and you feel the disparity in the gap, then I think the next thing is to pray, like, God, would you then give me the heart? Because honestly,
Mm.
I don't have it right now. But because you have called me to it, I want to step out in faith, and I want to be obedient. But I also don't want to do it with a heart that is like bitter or sad. So I think it comes back to, do I remember the grace in my life? Do I remember what has been given to me? Then there's a lot of like inside things that need to happen to pull yourself out of the spiral of like the downward spiral. And so it's a process. I think it's more indicative of like, are you actually just living a healthy life? Because sometimes stuff is on fire, but like most like fires, like finals or work deliverables, like get put out in like a couple weeks because the deadline comes, you take the exam, it passes. But if your season or your perpetual cycle, day in and day out, week in, week out, is the downward spiral, I think that's more of a health concern, like a spiritual, physical, emotional well-being concern. And so time to take stock of that and your time. And then I think, I think what the scary thing is, people get to a healthier baseline and then they just want to stay at the baseline rather than, again, coming to the Lord and asking the question, what do you want me to do with my time? Because we know that when we ask the Lord that question, the Lord surely will answer. And we are sometimes, I think, afraid to hear the answer because it means moving out of the comfort of our baseline rather than remembering, oh, but I have so much grace in this new life God has given me. How then would I choose not to just maintain this homeostasis of my time and my comfort, but to move beyond that? So I think the hope is, yes, to achieve a baseline that has pulled us out of the dumpster fire of whatever happened in our lives, but then that there would be a continual momentum to move beyond that and to continue to ask God the question, what do you want me to do with my time?
I see. Yeah, continually moving forward and continually growing. I like that answer, Kim.
And you didn't like it? We're going to make me answer it again?
Kim, can you give a different response?
Oh, man.
I think we're going to cut that one from the podcast.
Host asks too much of me. It's too much.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's a very like growth-centered mindset, but it's a mindset that's also like, yeah, like a bit of like crying out to God and like relying on Him, right? So everything's just coming back to grace and like seeing grace and like having grace for the strength that you need, right? And faith, right? To see. I think even like, yeah, as you're saying, right? Like a little bit of like working backwards, right? From like, why did I make this time to back to why did I make this time commitment? Why did like all these things? It reminds me of like Matthew, is it 16:24, when Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, right, he must deny himself, pick up his cross and follow me. And it's like, so often I find myself like, I'm thinking back to the times that I felt like maybe bitter when I was like serving, right? Little Hebrews 12, don't let a root of bitterness spring up, and work hard for that.
You good, Caleb? Do we want to talk about that
on this podcast? No, okay. But it's like, yeah, going back, right? Like, okay, I'm following after Jesus now. How did I get to picking up my cross, and why did I deny myself? Oh, I would come after Him because He was worth going after, which is, I think, a topic of a previous podcast and certainly a topic of a previous FNL by our one and only Joey Zia, right?
The one and only.
The one and only. But, we love, P. Doug loves talking about like purpose and like, conviction and stuff like that. And it's like, why would I come after Jesus? Oh, that's why, the grace that was shown to me. And now I'm like re-strengthened, or at least re-emboldened, right, in my conviction to continue picking up my cross, even if it's still difficult at the moment. It's still duty and not delight. Right.
Yeah, I think that it's part of it. I think as much as that is true, I sometimes think that when we think about time, all we focus on is the sacrifice rather than thinking about the great gain that we have when we tithe. And I'm like, oh, sometimes that's I think that's a stronger motivator, right? When in comparison, right? Like the cross that you bear for this lifetime in exchange for like the eternal kingdom of God. Like that's a good deal.
Yeah.
When you weigh it like that, but
present sufferings cannot compare.
Absolutely.
Right?
But I think I think we don't know what to do with our pain and our suffering, and to know that like God can meet it and God can relieve it, but it does not mean wiping everything and wiping all the responsibilities from our lives. It's like, oh, can God work through my sacrifice, the pain and the stretching that I feel, and can I believe that there is a great reward for me that there is so much more joy. There is so much of me that is going to become more like Jesus. And do I think that is worth it? I think we sometimes don't balance
Right.
that equation
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
We don't really look at what is actually not just at stake, but what is there to gain.
Mm.
I've been thinking that a lot about that a lot. Where I'm like, oh, I think we play small ball.
Small ball.
I think we're just kind of like, ooh, like this is like a lot, and then I don't gain that much, right? We make everything really small
Mhm.
rather than what is the right proportion to see this in. And I'm just like, oh, would I weigh it as a 1 hour conversation with a friend who was hurting, but watching them experience forgiveness,
Mm.
and I'm just like, oh, how do you even convert that
Right.
into like worth and value? And that
Mhm.
only stems from like, oh, do I believe that the grace that has been given to me in the life that I have to live is just worth it?
Mm.
That sounds like very lofty. That sounds like a little too. That sounds really a little too lofty for a podcast that's supposed to be very practically
It's lofty, but it's beautiful.
minded. It's
Yeah.
lofty but beautiful. But
Yeah.
I think there is a good and appropriate place to come back
Mm.
to that and to really kind of zoom out and look at our lives as a whole and to be
Mm.
like, wow, I am richly blessed in the life I've been given.
Right.
I'm like, oh, how can I then in turn give back and invest so that others too would experience that same kind of life? There is a
Yeah.
great multiplication when we give of ourselves in that way.
It's like the Romans 10, right? How beautiful it is the feet that carry the good news. Right?
Yeah. I mean, like, feet were dusty back in that time.
Yeah.
It's
Feet were
sandals.
dusty.
It's sandals and dirt roads.
Yeah. But I like landing the plane there, Kim. Unless you don't like landing the plane.
No,
there.
we can land the
But-
plane there. I'm for it. It's just like
Yeah.
to be generous because I'm like, oh, do we really believe that God has been generous to us in like the new life we have been given?
Right.
Like, do we actually believe that? And I think it's time to like come back a little bit, like, to the gospel.
Right.
Right? Do I believe that? Do I love Jesus not just because he's Savior, but can I love Jesus as King?
Mm-hmm.
And do I believe that my King is good and he has good intentions and the way that he will order my life and give me opportunities to use my time if it is in service to him? Do I believe that it'll also be good?
Right. I like that a lot.
Food for thought.
Yeah.
The question asked.
Food for thought. Yeah. It's like we've come full circle. Right?
We love it.
Maybe not like full circle. I don't know how to describe it. But we've landed the plane,
Love
right?
it.
Because we started with like giving time, being disciplined with that, to like how do I be generous in my life, right? And I think again that's like the push of all the disciplines or a lot of the disciplines, and even tithing, right? It's not just 10%, but how do I be generous, which is what the New Testament seems to be, and the entire Bible, let's be real, seems to be a lot more concerned about, right?
It's true.
Than just 10%.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyways, thank you so much for this discussion, Kim.
Thanks,
That was
Gillum.
I feel like I participated more than usual.
That's great. We love participation.
I'm not throwing shade at anyone. I love our usual discussions too. I feel like I'm a student learning. So
More
but
participation.
Today, yeah, but today was a little bit more participation. I was at office hours today.
Absolutely.
But thank you for participating by listening to our pod chat. We are Grace Covenant Chats, brought to you by Grace Covenant Church. If you're new here, go check us out at philly.gracecovenant.net. Join us on Sundays for our Sunday worship and our sermon series on Daniel at the moment.
Yeah.
And if you can't make that, check us out on YouTube. Same channel, YouTube Live. Let's go. But we will see you all next time.